President Putin agrees and does a ceasefire, I think we're going to be in very good shape to get it done.
Викрутиться тепер Росії буде складно. Вона повинна продемонструвати, якщо вона йде на сісфайр, що вона підтримує закінчення війни, або вона хоче продовжувати війну.
I think this is a very good thing in general, because now it puts the ball into Moscow's court, and the whole world is watching.
И мы за. Но есть нюансы.
The Ukrainians that went into Kursk definitively prove that you can take American and German manufactured weapons, you can kill Russians with them in Russia, and it does not result with a catastrophic vertical escalation.
Is actually all the signs, and we can say the Third World War started.
I think every time that the United States has failed to exercise its power to decisively defeat the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that risk increases.
So which part of the weapon Ukraine needs better to develop and start in manufacturing for the future?
The Ukrainians are going to be, I think, the experts on unmanned warfare systems. You are going to be the experts on how to win and survive attritional warfare. You will be the experts on how to wage large-scale combat operations and sustain large-scale combat operations against a vastly numerically superior adversary. I do think there's a military solution to this conflict. The military solution is as follows. We either provide the Ukrainians sufficient aid to defeat the Russian invasion of Ukraine in part or in whole, or we do not.
Hello, I'm Jenny Klochko, and you're watching my podcast, the platform for guest stories beyond your daily newsfeed. But the situation is we can't go away from newsfeed because there are too many things happening, too many political leaders throwing at us statement, one shocking statement by another one, and just all we need just be able to breathe, take a breath, and just carry on day by day. So today I would like us to look at the situation at the battlefield, at the front line, what's happening with military aid, with weapon, how things are progressing, what we can see, and I have the best person to talk to. My guest today is George Barros, the analyst from the Institute for the Study of War in Washington, D.C. Hello, George. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing okay. Better now that the aid and intelligence sharing has been resumed.
Yes, it is. So far, Ukraine and US agreed to immediate ceasefire, and it's been reported that it's restarted intelligence sharing and military aid. So what's your take on this?
Well, it's a correct decision. It's a good decision. By that, I mean the restoration of the military aid sharing and the intelligence sharing. I think it was a mistake to cut it in the first place because it worked against the American objectives of trying to get to a sustainable and robust ceasefire. Eroding Ukraine's leverage is not the correct way to do that, given the obstacle to peace is Moscow and Putin and the Kremlin, not Ukraine. It's also good, I think, in principle, that the Ukrainians and the Americans have agreed to a 30-day ceasefire, provided the Russian side agrees. I would have gone about this a slightly different sort of way, but I think this is a very good thing in general, because now it puts the ball into Moscow's court, and the whole world is watching to what extent will Vladimir Putin actually decide to proceed with what I assess to be his actual objectives, which is naked conquest of Ukraine, or will he accept the temporary ceasefire? I'm sure we all saw this morning the Kremlin response from the spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov. It's actually not an enthusiastic embrace of the ceasefire. He said it seems to be that the Kremlin was surprised by this proposal, which was a surprise to me. It seems that the Kremlin wants to get a back briefing from the Americans and understand exactly what the terms of this would be. And so we don't know yet what's going to happen. I hope that Putin does us the favor of violating, or rather not agreeing to the ceasefire, because it would make very clear to the strategic leadership here in Washington that the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin, are not interested in a peace deal, and that actually, if you're going to get to this sort of stable, robust sustainable peace that President Trump says he wants, then the answer is actually in defeating the Russians.
You said you would do it differently. How would you do it?
Well, American officials have gone and said on the record that there's no military solution to this conflict. And in my professional opinion, I actually disagree. I do think there's a military solution to this conflict. The military solution is as follows. We either provide the Ukrainians sufficient aid to defeat the Russian invasion of Ukraine in part or in whole, or we do not. The Russians seek to leverage their military, their economy, their defense industrial base, their population to wage a protracted war of attrition and dominate Ukraine. That is one of the military solutions to this conflict. Ukraine is subjugated. The other military solution to the conflict is the Ukrainians continue bleeding the Russians at an unsustainable rate. And we can talk about what that is, but the current rate of Russian losses is horrific. And the Ukrainians are imposing tremendous costs on the Russian Federation, which I assess are not sustainable in the 12 to 18-month period, assuming that the Russians get no reprieve from the current tempo of the fighting. And that you actually can degrade the Russian capabilities to a very significant degree, assuming the Russians keep losing at this current rate. And so that would also be an alternative version of a military solution, and that could, or at least at a minimum, set better conditions where the Ukrainians get to negotiate from strength, you further erode Russian leverage, and then you get to go into your negotiations in a place where you get to extract concessions from Russia.
Since last time we talked, the Kursk operation happened and Ukraine seized some territory and brought the war on Russian territory. And how wise was it to do this maneuver and give the Russians the taste of war? They pretend doesn't exist or is going on somewhere at the background. And do you think it would give like additional leverage to Ukraine, seeing how the situation developing by now and with a new team in the White House? What do you think?
Very complex question. Simple answers that say yes, it was ambiguously a good thing, or no, it's ambiguously a bad thing, are incorrect. They're trade-offs. There's a series of trade-offs. There's positive things that the operation achieved. There are trade-offs that were necessary to actually conduct the operation. And historians will be debating this for decades and centuries because it's actually ambiguous. The things that the Ukrainians achieved in Kursk that are good are as follows. It demonstrated that the war is not hopelessly stalemated. I'll note for you that back in August 2024, the predominant misconception about the war in Ukraine is that maneuver is not possible. Neither sides are moving. This is sort of a completely stalemated and deadlocked war. There's no dynamism left in the war. And for the Ukrainians to demonstrate that actually provided the correct conditions on the battlefield, you actually can achieve operational surprise. You actually can advance relatively rapidly using traditional maneuver tactics. That was important to demonstrate because it went against the incorrect characterization of the character of the war in Ukraine. That's number one. Number two, it was incredibly important for the policy to debate community here in the West about to what extent can you actually push back militarily against Russia. We've been debating for decades about Russian red lines and whether or not certain sorts of military activity against Russia would result in catastrophic escalation. And the Ukrainians that went into Kursk definitively proved that you can take American and German manufactured weapons, you can kill Russians with them in Russia, and it does not result with a catastrophic vertical escalation that many policymakers and analysts were warning about for years. In fact, it's just a continuation of conventional warfare, but in a new territory and a new geography, which has been my institution's assessment of the situation. But it's no longer a question for debate; it's a fact, and that was very important to get the increased permissions from Washington to allow the Ukrainians to conduct deeper fires with ATACMS missiles, which the Biden administration approved back in November 2024 and completely changed sort of what we consider to be acceptable for the war. And I can argue for why it was necessary to conduct ATACMS strikes. The Ukrainians have taken out logistics nodes, ammunition. It degrades the frontline fighting forces in the front line in Ukraine. that was very important. And I think it's very difficult to get that policy inflection without the Kursk operation. The other thing that the Kursk operation did is it forced the Russians to reprioritize different parts of the theater. The Russians had to redeploy units from other parts of Ukraine to go respond to the Kursk incursion, and that the Russians tied up about a combined arms army, north of 30,000 troops to go respond to the Kursk incursion. That is a combined arms army worth of combat power that cannot be deployed to stabilize the situation in Pokrovsk or to counterattack in Toretsk or to exploit Russian tactical breakthroughs near Velika Novoselka or Vuhledar. That's quite significant and important. And it threw a wrench in the Russian tempo and the momentum that they were trying to build, because they lost the initiative, at least in one part of the theater. And losing the initiative, having a contested initiative, very important in wartime. The Russians have the concept called operational art, operativное искусство, and the whole concept of successfully and skillfully using the operational art is to design campaigns in such a way that you are constantly imposing pressure and stress on the defender, and you never allow the defender to be able to strike back. You never allow the defender to plan a counter operation, and essentially you attack the enemy in location 1, and then when you culminate in location 1, you attack them in location 2 and location 3, and you set up in time and space all these combined efforts. And the Ukrainians successfully broke out of some of that dynamic with the Kursk operation. You asked about leverage. I've always been skeptical of the idea that the Ukrainians would leverage Kursk as a bargaining chip in negotiations, because it's been my assessment that the Russians always could retake the Kursk salient if they really wanted to and prioritized it. But that would require redeploying significant heavy forces out of Ukraine and to Kursk. The Kremlin was very clear they're not going to negotiate over Russian territory. They're not going to use it as a bargaining chip. I was never quite sold that they would do that either. So this doesn't really quite surprise me. And I we'll see at the end of the day how much of Kursk the Ukrainians end up holding, but they might have been given the order to withdraw given the rapid deterioration of the situation that we've seen since March 7, March 8.
Many advocates of Ukraine, the international speakers, and they always were warning, if Ukraine falls or if Ukraine doesn't get as much as Ukraine needs to defeat Russians, the Russian army progress and invade the NATO countries. Just today, there was the news that Poland wants 100,000 volunteers to take part in military training in 2027. Is an attribute the war actually is coming to NATO countries. And mind you, we just mentioned Kursk, and Northern Koreans were in Kursk. So is actually all the signs, and we can say the Third World War started.
World War III hasn't started yet, but I think we're very close to it. I think the likelihood of there being a significant war in Europe, or a Russian attack against NATO's eastern flank, I think the probability cone, the forecast cone for that dangerous course of action has grown substantially since the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think every time that the United States has failed to exercise its power to decisively defeat the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that risk increases. And I think every time that we discuss rewarding Putin with territory, by imposing it into Ukrainian territorial concessions, that does nothing but reinforce in Putin's mind and that he was able to essentially win some tactical gains, win some operational gains through fighting, and that only incentivizes and encourages more fighting and more warfare. So I don't think it's necessarily started yet, but I'm very concerned about it happening in the near future.
Ukrainian forces becoming more and more active on Russian territory. The drones attacks, and today was reported like Putin was informed about attack. My question is, where is he? Hasn't he noticed that it's been over 130 something drones were taken down, the Russians are reporting. So how do these attacks on Russian military base, on the oil depots, make the effect on the war situation in general?
Yeah, well, it seeks to degrade the Russian warfighting capacity because the Russian military consumes a lot of gasoline, a lot of lubricants, a lot of petroleum-based products for their military operations. And of course, Russia's main source of income is from its energy exports. And so if you're able to degrade their energy export capabilities, or in many cases, the storage areas where they hold a lot of oil, where they hold a lot of gas, then that has a direct effect on the battlefield, but it also has a direct effect on the Russian pocketbook. Um, and it also affects those very powerful and wealthy Russians within the inner circle of the Russian, the oligarch system. And those are people that Putin has some importance to actually keep them invested in the war. Because if he loses their support, then the political consensus around the soundness of the war can deteriorate. The strike campaign is important, and we know that it hurts the Russians. I mean, there's been many parts and times in this war where the Russians and the Ukrainians nearly reportedly came to an agreement to have a ceasefire on the deep strike campaigns that each country are waging against each other. The fact that the Russians were close to agreeing to that in the past, I think it suggests that they really don't like these strikes, and it's a good thing to have them stop because, frankly, candidly, the Russian strikes against Ukraine hurt the Ukrainians far more, and so imposing some commensurate costs on the Russians, even if they're not as bad, is still important, and it's part of a full war scale effort.
No long time ago, I had an exclusive interview with the commander of the Group 13 on the podcast, and this is the team who pushed away the Russian fleet from the Black Sea. So they managed to take down even the helicopter with the sea drone, Magura. So the aspect of war looks very inspiring, and especially when he had this interview, it was quite encouraging, really. But does what kind of or what aspect of military equipment does Ukraine need to establish the manufacturing to be self-sufficient? And as we know, being next door to Russia is like peace. Going to be only if Ukraine's going to be strong, fully prepared for the full-scale invasion. So, which part of the weapon Ukraine needs better to develop and start in manufacturing for the future?
Yeah. There's a lot of things. You mentioned drones, so my mind immediately went to drone manufacturing. But I'm sure the Ukrainians are developing drone components within Ukraine. By components, I mean the high quality electric motors that actually are put on the quadcopters and the hexacopters. Those are very important to make. And I say that because China nearly exercises a full global monopoly on the production of cheap, high quality, sort of quadcopter, hexacopter, FPV quality electronic motors for drones. They sell them in bulk quantities to both the Russians and the Ukrainians. And supply chain analysts have identified that China's near monopoly on producing these motors is a substantial piece of leverage that the Chinese have over everybody when it comes to manufacturing this. This applies not only, obviously, as a liability to Ukraine, but it's a liability to the United States. It's a liability to Russia. It's a liability to Taiwan, the Koreans. And so I think for the Ukrainians, they need to, they classify this information as protected. It should be a secret. I don't know. But the ability to domestically manufacture these drone components, particularly the electronic motors, that's a really important one. Beyond that, of course, is the manufacturing of important systems that can offset American capabilities. At this point in time, I would not count on American military assistance to be a sure planning assumption. I think the prudent planning assumption for Ukraine at this point is assume that you can no longer rely on American military assistance. There's several systems that the Americans have given Ukraine that the Ukrainians and the Europeans do not have a solid analog for. The first two that come to my mind, of course, are the Patriot air defense interceptors and the Patriot air defense system. The Ukrainians, once the Americans cut the Ukrainians off, you will have a limited supply of interceptors, and the Europeans don't have interceptors in sufficient quantities to give you a lot either. And so you have to develop some form of surface-to-air protection system that is capable of intercepting ballistic missiles. That's really hard to do. The Patriot is, again, the Americans basically have a monopoly over Europe when it comes to this ground-based air defense for ballistic missiles. That's sort of capability one that Ukraine should work to develop within its own country. Second capability is operational strikes. The Ukrainians rely on the American-made HIMARS system to engage targets beyond about 30 kilometers. And for that, they've been using the HIMARS system, but of course, that is dependent on American-provided targeting information. You can still launch HIMARS missiles without American intelligence and targeting information, but it's much harder to effectively use it without that data. And when you run out of missiles or you run out of the ammunition, then your launches are no good. And the Ukrainians and the Europeans really don't have a good analog for that system either. So those are some of the key vulnerabilities that the Ukrainians should focus on.
Could you explain how the U.S. intelligence cut when when they stopped sharing intelligence with U.S. and it's basically those information started spreading, the Storm Shadow missiles became useless in Ukraine. How is that? And is it true?
I have no independent basis on which to verify the reports of what happened. What I can say, based off of my understanding of how the intelligence sharing works, it would make sense of certain capabilities being degraded. So my understanding, and this is largely based off of Ukrainian officials' statements and Ukrainian reporting, is that the Ukrainians' intelligence capability to look into Russia gets quite poor rapidly the further you go deeper into the Russian interior. And so that means that the Ukrainians do rely on American targeting information in order to be able to conduct strikes against dynamic targets. By dynamic, I mean targets that move, targets that have defenses that have to be overcome. If hitting a stationary oil rig, an oil facility that does not move, that has no protection, that's fine to do because it's not dynamic to target. But trying to hit a unit on the move, trying to hit an expensive piece of equipment on the move, or a shipment of ammunition that's on the move, or that has electronic warfare or air defense protection, like that's what I'm talking about here. And for that, that's what you need the American intelligence for. I'd note that we've not collected reports of a single ATACMS strike into Russia after the intelligence shut off. I actually didn't collect a single one of those since Donald Trump was inaugurated on January 20. I observed reports that the Ukrainian HIMARS strikes in Kursk became much less effective back after the intelligence sharing cut off, which would make sense. We observed indirect indicators that negatively impact Ukraine's air defense umbrella. The Ukrainian Air Force, as you know, reports every day about the number of drones and missiles that Ukraine's air defense intercepts. And after the Ukrainian intelligence sharing was cut off, the intercept rate for Russian ballistic missiles over Ukraine went down drastically. It was actually 0 out of 0 ballistic missiles intercepted on one day, which was quite telling because the Ukrainians typically have a positive intercept rate against ballistic missiles. They usually hit at least one and usually more than one, but it was 0 for 0, which to me suggests that the intelligence sharing that we were providing was also helping enable more effective Ukrainian air defense. And so that seems to have been one of the effects of the cutoff. And I'm very glad that it's restored because it seemed like it was a needless decision at the time in retrospect.
How the mineral deal is important for the future of Ukraine, for the Ukraine's defense capabilities, and basically the situation on the front line right now and after the war.
Mineral deal is very important to go through because it is the most compelling argument that the Ukrainians have to provide to the Trump administration for why the Trump administration should continue materially supporting Ukraine. You cannot make, I think, an effective argument to the Trump administration about the rule of law, international norms, the liberal democratic values. Those are not compelling arguments to this administration. Even saying we have to deter Russia, we have to, protect our NATO allies, that's not a compelling argument. What is a compelling argument, and this is the argument that Yermak came and delivered to the Americans back when Donald Trump was inaugurated, was we have critical resources, we have minerals. Would you rather go to the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians, or would you rather have it belong to the United States and America's partners? And that's a compelling argument. It's not the argument that I find compelling personally, but that is the argument that's compelling to this administration. And so what this does is it allows, it helps explain why it is necessary to continue to be involved in Ukraine. And the material worth of the minerals is an alternative funding source for providing American military weapons to Ukraine, instead of it just being a series of subsidies paid for by the American taxpayer. Ukraine needs the weapons. Ukraine will lose the war without additional and continued military support from foreign partners. And so if we can link American interests, economic interests in Ukraine, if we can find a way to continue sending the critical aid that is necessary for Ukraine to continue to exist and set the conditions for Russian defeat, that is a positive thing. And more importantly, I want us to be in a place where this administration understands that our interests are aligned with Ukraine. Our interests are not aligned with cooperation with Russia. And I want us to avoid this pitfall, which I see a lot of people talking about in town, which is that we need to end the war in Ukraine because if we don't, we run the risk of Russia and China becoming more closely aligned, and we should actually be partners with Russia against China. I think that's a very naive way of thinking about things, because the Russians and the Chinese actually already are aligned, and the Chinese have an interest that the Russians win in Ukraine in part or in whole, because that supports the Chinese objectives and China's neighborhood with vis-a-vis Taiwan. So that's why the mineral deal is important to go through.
So 3 years of war. We all know the negative sides of it, the losses, the damages, the everything was like the sad and devastating brought this war. But if we look at the gains in terms of Ukrainian high profile on the global scene, in terms of reformation of Ukrainian army and F-16 and even French fighter jets in Ukrainian sky, what else would you add reflecting on 3 years of fighting for independence?
You guys are, it's incredible what you're doing from a military science perspective. I mean, you are forging the future of warfare. The Ukrainians and the Russians are the only ones that know what it means to conduct large-scale combat operations in the 21st century, with unmanned systems, with electronic warfare. This is stuff that is completely hypothetical to the best military minds in the United States and our American military academies. I mean, you guys are writing the textbook, and you are unlocking the secrets for how to wage war. And World War III, God forbid it occurs, but World War III, when it occurs, will be deeply influenced by the lessons learned in this war here. And the Ukrainians are going to be, I think, the experts on unmanned warfare systems. You are going to be the experts on how to win and survive attritional warfare. You will be the experts on how to wage large-scale combat operations and sustain large-scale combat operations against a vastly numerically superior adversary. And I think, in addition to the variety of things that you talked about, I mean, this is something to be very proud of, because you are doing a tremendous service to the entirety of the free world as we are confronting increasingly emboldened adversaries.
Last time we spoke, we established your Ukrainian connections, and usually the last question for my guest is, it doesn't matter if from Ukraine or outside of Ukraine, I ask, what do you love about Ukraine? I know you've been in Ukraine, and we established that you have roots on your mom's side. And so I try to angle the question, what do you like, sort of like about Ukrainian connection in your American identity?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I think American identity is very interesting because we're a melting pot. I identify first and foremost as an American. My dad's side of the family is Filipino. My surname is not Ukrainian, and it's not a traditional Anglo-Saxon surname. But so I guess I'm half Filipino, I'm half Ukrainian, I'm all American. I'm an American. I appreciate that it broadens my horizons. It helps me understand that the United States doesn't live in an isolated world where we're flanked by two oceans and nothing's going on. Um, I understand that it helps me appreciate the fact that we have interests in other places. It helps me understand and appreciate the fact that America does have a value add to give beyond just being in isolation and not in consultation with other countries. And for me, I think it's a very important perspective because it's very easy for Americans when they get assimilated into the culture to just want to retreat and be an American and not be connected to anybody other than our very large country of 350 million some people.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, and I hope to see you soon on the podcast. Unfortunately, the newsfeed every day is giving us new reasons to talk about more about the war rather than for culture, identity, and the soft power. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny, for having me. I really appreciate it.
That was George Barros from the Institute for the Study of War in Washington, D.C., and we discussed the current events, though it's the platform for guest stories beyond your daily newsfeed. So let me know what you think. Would you agree with us or disagree, or you have something new to add to this discussion? And we will talk about it on Monday Live after this interview is published at 7:30 p.m. UK time. And on Thursdays, our lives on Thursday, we discuss the current affairs. So it would be great if you could join. And please don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and become part of our great community on this podcast. I'm Jenny Klochko. Thank you for watching.